Hi guys, welcome back aboard good old not Athena. We've been here in Charleston, South Carolina for about 3 weeks now, dropping the keel on this Fountain Peugeot Helia. The keel has been sitting here underneath the boat drying out for a couple of weeks. Now it's finally time to rebuild it so we can prepare to get it smushed back into place. My name is Mess, this is my wife Ava. I've spent the last 5 years on a somewhat extensive refit of our 1987 Warrior 38 named Athena. That was a DIY fun-packed adventure complete with a very extensive osmosis treatment, building a new rudder using vacuum infusion, rebuilding the entire deck, gutting and subsequently rebuilding most of the interior, painting the top sides, and a ton of other projects. The summer of 2021 we started cruising full time. Now we're finally ready to begin our adventure. If you haven't seen the videos from the last couple of weeks, you may not know why we had to drop this keel. Long story short, a recent survey showed water trapped inside of the keel using thermal imaging, but there was no dripping or weeping from any of the visible parts of the keel. The only logical conclusion was that the leak must be in the part of the keel that's hiding inside of the hull. We painstakingly cut the adhesive that holds the keel in place and carefully lowered it down. Now, inside of the keel I found the worst application of expanding foam I have ever seen. There were giant voids and no foam at all in the aft 1/3 of the keel. While sanding and flushing the inside of the keel, I found not one, not two, but 3 separate leaks on the top of the keel. 2 of the leaks were from the holes the yard used to fill the keel with the expanding foam, and then there's a crack here between the 2 shells that make up the keel. I've broken down the rebuilding of the keel into steps here so we can see what we need to do each day of this week. Today being Monday, we need to clean up the inside of the keel so we're ready to foam. We need to sand the edges or the seams on both of the keels in preparation of laying up a bit of glass. And last but certainly not least, today I need to get the bungs reinserted into the 2 holes here and lay up a bit of glass so we're ready to start foaming the inside of the keel tomorrow. The reason we're going to be sanding the edges on both of the keels, including the one that's still attached to the boat, which is currently not leaking, is just a bit of a preventive measure. The keels are built out of 2 separate shells that are smushed together, and then the 2 halves are adhered together with some adhesive. And it's not all that uncommon to see them split along the joint or the seam, and laying up a little bit of glass is just a very cheap insurance to make sure that doesn't happen. For all of the oh glorious fiberglassing and foaming we're going to do this week, I've ordered some products from Total Boat. This should be everything we need to fix the keel. Over the past 10 years here on YouTube, I've used a bunch of different brands of epoxy. I've used a bunch of 5-to-1 epoxies, some 3-to-1 epoxies. I have never used a 2-to-1 epoxy before, so this is gonna be kind of interesting. This is Total Boat's high performance 2-to-1 epoxy. This is a non-blushing epoxy. We'll get back to what the rest of the stuff here on the table is as we start using it, but for now, enough yammering on. Let's suit up and start sanding. It's been a while since I've had the chance to partake in any oh glorious sanding, but one thing I have learned over the years is the warmer the weather, the worse the itch when sanding fiberglass. Fully protected from the horrid fiberglass itch, we set to work. 2 different tools are going to come into play today. There is Mr. Angle Grinder with 36 grit paper and Mr. Bosch 6-inch sander with 80 grit paper. The angle grinder is the perfect tool for removing a lot of material fast, as long as you don't care about the surface finish. Cleaning up the inside of the keel was a great job for Mr. Angle Grinder, and so was removing the laminate around the holes we drilled to let the water out of the keel. Mr. Bosch is a better choice for the outside of the keel, where I want to keep the amount of fairing to a minimum, like for instance the rounded edges. As the last bit of oh glorious sanding during day 1, I cleaned up the bungs from the top of the keel. With all of the oh glorious sanding on today's to-do list crossed off of the list, we're finally ready to start patching up the holes on the keel. For the big holes, I'll use the bungs that came out of the keel. We're just going to adhere these in place with a little bit of thickened epoxy. For any kind of adhering or gap filling, I've always used silica to thicken epoxy. It's super easy to work with and you can get the exact consistency you want because, well, you're the one doing the thickening. The other option is to go with a thickened epoxy. That's certainly more convenient, but I just really like the silica. The only thing is, just don't breathe this stuff. The 2-to-1 epoxy I ordered from TotalBoat came with this set of pumps. Now for bigger quantities, say if you need to lay up a lot of fiberglass, it's easier to mix your epoxy based on weight or volume, but for smaller repairs, like what I'm going to be doing today, pumps like these are super convenient. We have all the epoxy we need, we have some silica for thickening the epoxy, and I also have a little bit of 1708 to just go over the bungs with, just to make absolutely sure they don't pop out. Very conveniently, there's a little sticker on the pump matching the color of the lid on the hardener, so you don't get the pumps confused. After having primed both pumps, we were off to the races. I mixed up a little bit of thickened epoxy and coated the hole for the bung as well as the bung itself with a generous blob. To make sure we'll never have another leak from the top of the keel, I'm also going to add a couple of layers of glass. Today I'm just adding a single layer in preparation of pouring the foam tomorrow. It's the next morning. The bungs and the patches I laid up on the top of the keel cured nicely overnight. The first thing we did today was to flip the keel over in preparation of pouring foam. If I consult my little plan for today, which is Tuesday, we're going to be foaming and laying up a bit of glass. I've only had a chance to play with polyurethane expanding foam a couple of times before. Most of the stuff I used during Athena's refit was a foaming epoxy that's way stronger than a 2 or 6 pound polyurethane expanding foam. It's more of a core material, but it's also way more expensive and way heavier, and it's not really what we need for this keel. The foam I pulled out of the keel felt lighter than a 2-pound foam, to be honest, so I think it's safe to assume that the foam that was in there was only there to provide buoyancy in case the keel separates from the hull. TotalBoat refers to this as a 94% closed cell foam. They do have a slight word of caution saying that if the expanded foam is submerged in water for years, then it may lose its positive buoyancy. After part A and B are mixed, the foam will start to expand rather rapidly, as you'll see. When it's doing that, there is a fair amount of heat and some pressure. Now, we're going to be pouring this into an open space here, so it's not that big of a concern here, but it is something to be aware of. And just to be careful and make sure nothing goes wrong, we're going to be pouring in smaller batches. Before pouring the foam, I wanted to reinforce the edges of the keel. We covered the table in plastic and cut out strips of 1708. Cutting oh glorious fiberglass is time consuming and not all that much fun. If you're going to be cutting a lot of fiberglass, I highly recommend an electric pair of cutters. I mixed up a tiny bit of thickened epoxy. Normally you don't use thickened epoxy when laying up fiberglass, but the bottom of the keel has a bunch of voids and small imperfections. I sanded the voids before filling them with tiny dabs of thickened epoxy. For a smaller layup like the one we're doing here, it's going to be way easier and less messy to wet out the fiberglass before placing it on the keel. You only need to use as much epoxy as the fiberglass will hold. There's no upside to adding more. A fin roller works great for getting out any tiny air bubbles and wetting out all of the fibers. With the fiberglass placed on top of the keel, I went over it again with the fin roller to make sure there was no air trapped in between it and the keel. We repeated the same process for the keel that's still attached. Getting fiberglass to stick overhead can sometimes be tricky, but here it worked out without using any fancy tricks. With fiberglass all over the exposed edges on the still mounted keel, it was finally time to pour the foam. I mixed up 750 milliliters of part A and 750 milliliters of part B. You have around 25 seconds to stir the two parts together, so it's good not to dilly-dally. This clip is sped up by 8 times. In real time, the expansion happens over about a minute and a half. We poured all of the foam into the top of the keel to avoid any voids before laying it down on its side. To make sure we got all the way into the corners, I used a little scrap piece of hose to direct the expanding foam. Within a few hours, the entire keel was filled with foam. The inboard side of the keel has a bunch of gel coat blisters. To stabilize the surface where we'll be adhering the keel back into the hull, we decided to lay up a single layer of 4-ounce cloth. This stuff likes to fray when you cut it, so I applied a layer of tape to keep the fibers somewhat in check. With cloth that's this light, I like to wet out the surface with a little bit of epoxy, lay up the cloth, and then go over it again with more epoxy. After making completely sure the forearms cloth was wetted out and we didn't have any voids under it, we laid up 1708 on the forward and the trailing edges of the keel, and voila, we were done for the day. Something kind of funny happened when I was pouring foam into the top of the keel. You guys might remember the tiny little crack on the top of the keel. Well, when I was pouring the foam into the top of the keel, I hadn't yet glassed this side, the top side of the keel, and turns out the foam actually bubbled out through that little crack. So I think we definitively can say that crack was at least one part of the leak issue. Yesterday, when I was laying up the thin, flimsy 4-ounce cloth over the top of the keel, after the epoxy had gone tacky, I went over it again with another coat of epoxy to fill the structure of the cloth. I do that so that I can have something to sand without actually sanding into the thin fiberglass. Speaking of sanding or grinding, today is going to be the most labor-intensive day on the keel project. Today we're going to be knocking down the excess foam. That's going to be quick. We're also going to get rid of the excess fiberglass here. That's also going to be fairly quick. The labor-intensive part is going to be beveling the edges around the holes I cut on the keel and the panels to be able to glass in the pieces we cut out. It was once more back into the personal sweat lodge that is a Tyvek suit in the sweltering South Carolina heat. One little trick I have found that helps me a little bit is to apply a bit of tape to the back of the hood that keeps it from sagging down in front of your eyes. The foam was, as expected, super easy to sand. It almost melted away at the mere sight of the 36 grit paper on Mr. Angle Grinder. Before starting to bevel the edges of the fiberglass, I wanted to get rid of most of the excess foam. I measured and marked the edge of my bevel and then set to work making very expensive dust. Even with the aggressive 36 grit paper, it took about 4 hours to bevel all of the edges. Before escaping the sweat-filled water balloon that was my Tyvek suit, I did the first bit of detail sanding on the top of the loose keel as well as the bottom of the attached keel. Relieved to finally be out of the Tyvek suit, I set to work trimming the foam using an oscillating multi-tool and also Mr. Angle Grinder to take away enough foam that the two pieces of outer skin sits exactly where they're supposed to. I spread a generous amount of thickened epoxy on the back of the two panels and smushed them in place. And just like that, after 8 hours of glorious sanding and foam trimming, I was finally ready to start laying up glass. As the last action of the day, we added peel ply on top of the freshly laid up glass before heading home. That was a long day at the boatyard. Because I used Totalboat's 2-to-1 non-blushing epoxy, I won't have to worry about blushing, which is one of the reasons why you'd normally use peel ply. But good old peel ply will still save you from a fair bit of sanding. I generally don't use peel ply unless it's a large flat surface, because unless you get all the air bubbles out and get the peel ply thoroughly wetted out, it can cause more problems than it's actually fixing. The peel ply was flapping in the breeze when we left yesterday, and it looks like we got a giant bubble here. That is going to be annoying. And also it looks like when the peel ply lifted up, it lifted the top layer of fiberglass a little bit. Except for the little annoying spot up here in the corner, everything else looks really good. I did end up going over the gel coat in this area up here, so we'll have to knock that back down, but that should be quick with Mr. Angle Grinder. Once that's done, we will barely have a gap here in the middle, but the gap that is going to be there will fill with a tiny bit of fairing compound. Because the keel is below the waterline, we're going to use an epoxy-based fairing compound. For smaller repairs above the waterline, it's really nice to be able to use a polyester-based putty because it's a lot quicker to work with. Typically, the epoxy fairing compounds, they take a lot longer to cure before you're ready to sand them. Having said that, Totalboat does claim that this stuff will be ready to sand within 3 hours at 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. That's pretty toasty, but I think we're going to get up to around 88 degrees Fahrenheit today, so that'll be fun to see. But yeah, this is going to be my first ever attempt with Total Fair, so this is exciting. Yesterday I got 2 applications of Total Fair applied to the keel, and while the keel is not 100% perfect yet, we're certainly getting very close. I also dug out all of the little gel coat blisters we had on the inboard side of the keel, and I also sanded the top of the keel so it's nice and matte. My plan has always been to hold off on priming the visible part of the keel until it was back in its pocket. That way we can stick to the minimum overcoating interval and we won't have to sand in between the primer and the anti-fouling. In the plan I showed you guys earlier in the video, I was going to be priming the top of the keel today. But I've had a little bit of a change of heart. The keel, as mentioned earlier, is only held in place by adhesive. There's no mechanical fasteners or anything like that. This is probably just a prime example of me overthinking stuff, but I don't know how strong the bond is between the primer and the fiberglass, and I'm afraid it could end up being the weakest link in the chain that's holding the keel in place. My new plan is simply just to apply a few more layers of unthickened epoxy to the top of the keel so we build up the film thickness we'll require to keep water out of the laminate. Applying those 2 or 3 coats wet on tacky means we can get it done in one day without sanding in between the coats, so it should be a fairly labor-easy task. There is a small chance that we're going to be able to install the keel next week, but that is wholly dependent on us figuring out exactly what type of adhesive to use and being able to get our hands on that adhesive. So yeah, we'll see. We may end up pushing the installation of the keel 1 week, but we are very close. And on that cheerful note, I'll end this week's video here. Now, if you have heard a weird sound in the background throughout this video, Let me just explain what that is. You might be hearing it right now. That is a ginormous cargo ship right over here that's unloading some kind of gravel. And yeah, I apologize if that's been an annoying background sound. There's not a lot I can do about it. But yeah, either way, I hope to see all of you guys back here in the yard next week for yet more glorious DIY fun. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!